All right, so we're going to get started here. The idea of this is how to think about your records from a very broad perspective, using disaster planning as kind of a framework for that. Um, what I have here is this is a Chinese term called Xiu Tao, which is I learned it through martial arts. It's the idea of Xiu Tao is like a little idea or the thought that is a seed that grows into something else. And I wanted to kind of explain where I was coming from with this. And what it was last fall, I was kind of out on my back porch, and what I was thinking about at that moment was Hurricane Helene in Asheville. Uh, Asheville is a place that I love to visit. It's one of my wife's favorite places in the world, and it was just in utter devastation. And I was just kind of thinking about everything that was going on out there and how people were cut off because the roads were washed out. And I was kind of getting a little worked up, to be honest with you. Uh, just frustrated and angry at the situation, even though there's nothing really I could do to ameliorate that situation for anyone. But while I was sitting around getting mad, I just kind of thought of something my dad used to say, which is, don't get mad, get ready. Anger doesn't really do anything. All it is an emotion that kind of can feed you. But what it can help you do is start to plan out for what you will do if this situation occurs again. And that, as I was thinking, I kind of thought, well, wow, that might actually be a good way to approach disaster planning for records management. And so that's kind of where the little idea started that grew into this presentation. It's the idea about how are you going to plan for something like this? And as you're planning for something like this, what can you learn about your records and how they work for you? That's kind of the idea we're starting from today. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to talk about a lot of disasters that affected records in particular, but just some of the things that have happened in the past, just that we can think about going forward. And the first one of these is a fire at the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. in 1921. This is a huge one because if you ever work with genealogy or things like that, you know that the 1890 census of the United States was almost completely destroyed in this fire. It was a fire that started in the building. They reported the fire at 5:30 in the afternoon. Everybody in the building went home at 4:30. So it's like it always seems to happen. Disasters happen when you're not there. You come in the next morning and find out something went wrong or something like that. In this case, they did notice the fire was going on. They called in firefighters, and no one was seriously injured. There were a couple of firefighters who kind of overcome by smoke, but because there's nobody in the building, there were no people injured, no office workers injured, but massive amounts of records were destroyed. And as a matter of fact, it was this fire and the destruction of all these records that led to the creation of the National Archives, and the National Archives being given their own building in the 1930s. So that's kind of the little idea that generated the National Archives building in DC. But speaking of the National Archives, if you work with military records, you're familiar with this disaster. It's the National Archives storage facility in St. Louis. It was a 6-story building, and the fifth and sixth stories caught on fire in 1973 and destroyed something on the order of 14 million military records. Separation records, usually from people who separated from the military between like 1919 and 1955, something like that. So a lot of World War II and Korean War service records were just wiped out. And part of the issue is they don't even necessarily have a good idea of what was lost because there are so many things that were kind of in transit. They were moving from one building to another. They were microfilming things. They were processing things. And so there are some things that they don't know if they're there or not. They assume they're destroyed. They can't really prove it one way or the other. This one, I was saying everything happens after people are gone. They noticed the fire at about 12:30 in the morning, a little after midnight. Uh, the fire department was on the scene within minutes, but it took like the fire department went into the building, but within a couple of hours, the heat was too intense and they had to back out, and the fire just kind of burned itself out over days. So just a massive, massive destruction. You kind of see on this picture here, you can see the shelving. That's all it was on those top 2 floors, shelving, 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 shelving of paper records. Most of us here will probably remember Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina hit in August of 2005. And I think what I read was that they managed to get all of the floodwaters from the broken levees and stuff out of downtown New Orleans in about 43 days. So parts of New Orleans were still technically flooded for 6 weeks. And the loss in property and the loss in records is just astounding. Billions and billions of dollars in damages. A little more personally, this is a disaster that I lived through myself. There was a flash flood at the University of Louisville, well, not the university, it was a flash flood in Louisville, Kentucky in August of 2009. That was when I was working at the University of Louisville, and we got about 6 inches of rain in an hour. Not even joking. It's the most biblical thing I've ever seen in my entire life. And this building that we have pictures of here, this was the home of the registrar's office, the bursar's office, the places like handled transcripts and billing and stuff for the university. And they were water rescuing people out of this building because it was in a little low-lying area. They were pulling people out of the building in boats during the day of the disaster. This picture was taken the next day when we went in. But again, millions and millions of dollars worth of damage. Cars were just kind of like floating. There is enough water to move cars out of their parking lot that they were just totaled. No human loss of life though. But that's my personal experience with a disaster, right? I was in there the next day, went to a meeting at the president's office in a t-shirt, a pair of shorts, and galoshes. And that first thing we did was go into the basement of this building, looking for records and see what we could salvage. But those are big, huge disasters. More common are little small disasters. Thank goodness. Every day we don't want to have a big fire destroying millions and millions of records. But, you have things like this, pipes burst or something. And that's a serious leak right there. I have seen a leak kind of like that once, where a fire suppression pipe burst, and it was literally just like spraying water up against the glass windows and stuff. But like the most common thing we all see is something like this. You kind of walk in one day and you're like, how long has that stain been on the ceiling? Where did that come from? How long has it been like that? I mean, clearly that means we got a water leak somewhere. What do we do about the water leak? Are there mold problems involved? Do we need to like move things out of this room to remedy the mold problem before we can do anything else? To remedy the roof leak, then the mold problem, and then move things back in. That's kind of the most common scenario we see. But certainly there's always the risk of flooding from storms, flooding from heavy rains or burst pipes or something like that, or small fires or things like that. And the fires, before I came to work at the University of Louisville, there was a disaster there. That the records warehouse that a lot of our records were stored in had a small fire there. It was happened to be Christmas Eve. And the only way they discovered it was one of the university police officers was driving by and saw water pouring out of the loading dock doors. So there was a small amount of records lost from fire, that those records were just completely destroyed. There was a significant amount of records lost from the sprinklers going off. And some of those were utterly destroyed. Some of them could be remediated. We'll kind of come back to that concept here in a little bit. But there's another form of disaster, and that's just plain neglect. Either purposeful or accidental neglect. This is a box of records that we like to pull out for visual effect sometimes. These records were records from the 17 and 1800s that were in the attic of a courthouse here in Virginia. And they had been up in the attic for time out of amount. People had forgotten about them. And they hired an HVAC guy to come in and work on their HVAC system. And the HVAC guy kind of came down out and said, there's like old stuff up in the attic. Nobody there knew it was there. So They called the library. We came in and tried to pull out what we could. And we were able to salvage a lot of records there, but some of them are just like this. They were just absolutely and utterly ruined. And that's a kind of disaster in and of itself. Hopefully one that we have a little more power to deal with. But if you don't know something's there, you don't know it's there. The issue with these records is not that the people in the office were doing something wrong. It was sometime, decades and decades ago, these things were stuck up in the attic and nobody properly communicated it to anyone else. So when these people were working in the office, they had no idea they were there. It's not anything of their fault. They just didn't know. All right. So I want to talk about the process of disaster planning and where do you start? And that's a really broad topic. Okay. The first thing you want to do is adjust your perspective. Now I'm going back to this photograph of Katrina. All right. Because Katrina did a lot of damage, millions of homes destroyed, billions of dollars of damage. And yeah, the records destruction was radical because it's New Orleans in August and they didn't have power or water. Everything was contaminated. Mold grew everywhere. It was an absolute nightmare scenario for records loss. Let's dial it back. 1,400 people died in Katrina. When it comes to that, loss of records is not even a concern. We have to deal with the human toll of a disaster first. That's the way I want everybody to understand that. We're talking about records and so forth, but the first thing we have to worry about is your people. When it comes to your people, you have to make sure everybody knows what your emergency plans are. If we have a fire drill in this building and nobody knows where to go, then when there's an actual fire, that's not going to be a good thing. We want everybody to understand that there is a plan. This is where the plan is. We want everybody to understand the plan. We want everybody to understand when it's time to shelter for a tornado, this is where you go. You evacuate the building for a fire. This is where you go. You want to make sure that there is a specific rally point or a way for you to contact each other. Like if everybody exits the building for a fire drill, where are the people in your department going to go? How can you account for everybody? You want to be able to tell first responders to the degree that you can who was in the building, who you can account for, and who you suspect may still be in the building. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, I worked at the reactor facility that was still there at that point in time. And we had, it was a nuclear reactor. So we had a very big, very detailed disaster drill there once. And I was just, a student worker doing photocopies and stuff. And, when we were outside in the parking lot, having, simulated evacuating the building, somebody came up to me and said, "Do you know if so-and-so is in the building?" And I'm like, "I don't think so. I don't recognize their car in the parking lot." And somebody else said, "That's their car in the parking lot. We know that person is probably here somewhere." I didn't think he was in the building. He was in the building. He was a person simulating a casualty. And I didn't know he was there. Somebody else knew he was there. That kind of thing is important. So can you account for the people that you think were in the building? Do you know who's teleworking today? Can you contact somebody that's on their way in and says, "Okay, no, don't come in, stay out. I'm just glad to account for you." Can you tell people where to expect someone to be? This person usually works in this lab. The stairwell closest to that lab is here. I would expect to find them somewhere between the exit, that stairwell, and their lab to be able to tell the first responders where to go. I am a floor warden here at the library. When we have a disaster or a drill or something here at the library, I always tell my people, I am not going to be at the rally point. I am going to be in a stairwell with one of our colleagues who is mobility challenged. And so if there's, any serious injury, I can try to move that person. But as long as it's just like a localized disaster or, maybe there's a fire in another part of the building, The idea is that person and I wait in the stairwell where it should be relatively safe for first responders to arrive. And the first responders will help move that mobility challenged person out. Uh, so that kind of thing is also important to understand. What are people's roles in case of a disaster? So this is all talking about the human factor, okay? Understanding where your people are, where they're supposed to be, how you can account for them, and making sure that everybody understands that. Because if they don't understand it, it's not really going to be helpful. But disaster planning generally presents a unique opportunity. And I'm talking about the planning, not the disaster. That's something different. When it comes to thinking about a real disaster, it's an opportunity to kind of take a big step back and say, what is the critical function or functions of my agency? What is it that we do? And what does it take to get that done? If you ask me on a given day, hey, Chad, what do you need to do your job? I'm going to say, oh, yeah, I need my laptop. I want my second monitor. I want my phone. I want air conditioning. I want lights. I want internet access. I want, a cell phone reception and all this stuff so I can do the things I always do. But in a Katrina kind of situation where my building is out of commission for a week, a month, any length of time, what do I need to do my job? In my particular case, the answer is I need the Library of Virginia's web servers running because that's where all of our information that we need to do our job resides, basically. That's where the retention schedules are. That's where the lists of records officers are. That's where the contact information and so forth is. So to be able to do my job of advising people on records management, I need to be able to have access to those retention schedules, that contact information and so forth. I can access that material anywhere with an internet connection, as long as the library servers are up and running. If they're not, it doesn't matter where I am, I can't do what I need to do. And looking at it again from a broad point of view, if you're a public school, what do? You educate your kids. Can you do that if the building is knocked out? Yeah, what would it take? You could go to like the local gymnasium or something like that, or the auditorium at the hospital or the National Guard Armory or something like that, and set something up. What records would you need to be able to continue to educate your kids? Well, you kind of want to know what your class roles are, right? So you know who's there, you know who's present, you know who's getting the education. If you're taking exams, you can grade the papers and transmit those grades in a meaningful way to show that they're progressing through their education. If you're a police department, your job is keeping the people safe. What do you need first? Probably your communications to be able to dispatch officers and make sure that your people are going where they need to be. It's going to depend on what your agency does. And look at it from that point. If we absolutely positively had to have one thing, what is that one thing? If we can't do anything without these people, who are those people? Identify them. What equipment do you need to get the job done? Anything. Look at it from the most fundamental point of view possible. Not just what would I need to do my job on a typical Tuesday? What would I need to do my job if this building was out of commission for a month? How would I fulfill the functions of my office? Okay. And then you can kind of start working outward. Our basic function at the Library of Virginia is preserving the records and the collections of the Commonwealth, right? My personal job is doing records management advice for my clientele. But what are some of the other functions of the library? Payroll, accounting, they have to be able to, account for the expenditures that we make. For example, if we contract with a disaster recovery firm, we need to make sure we got money coming in. This is where our bank accounts are. This is how we can pay whatever that disaster recovery vendor is. make sure that they get paid for their services so they keep serving us, right? That's going to be pretty important. I personally like to get paid. I want payroll to go through. But those are secondary concerns. If you can't accomplish your primary functions, your secondary functions can go by the wayside. You need to establish those primary functions first. And then once you get the secondary stuff down, once you get payroll going again, you can make sure everybody's hours are accounted for. You can make sure that people that the bills are getting paid. Then you can think about things like janitorial or landscaping or things that are just way down the list. They are a part of your business. You know, if they're not cleaning the bathrooms in this building for a month, that's going to be a problem. But is it as important as making sure we get our bills paid? No, it's not. Is it important as making sure we can give records management advice to our clients? Definitely not. And I call that like a tertiary function. Okay. So starting from the center, this is the core of what we do. What do we need to accomplish that? Personnel, material, records. Then going outward from the most critical to somewhat critical to significant but not critical to less significant. In that order. And when you're prioritizing, you've got to be prepared to make difficult decisions. You know, for those of us who are old enough to remember MASH, this is, I put a happy picture, but to talk about a not so happy thing. You know, they work in a military surgical hospital and they're sometimes forced to make choices. Do we try to put effort into saving this person who is critically injured? Do we put our effort in someone who is less injured, but still seriously, or someone who's, you know, got a splinter or a cut or something like that? It depends on what you can do with the resources you have. And you can't make everything priority one. So there has to be difficult choices made. And some of those choices are going to be painful to someone somewhere. But as we were talking about this presentation a week ago, a colleague and I were saying, you know, here at the library, let's say we have a will book from 1670 that, you know, its physical self is a priceless artifact, really. It's just fantastic. But we have it's scanned, it's microfilmed, we have other copies of it. And then we have, let's say, some records from the governor's office from the 1950s that they may be kind of mundane records, but that's the only copy that exists. There wasn't an electronic version of it. They were never filmed. They were never, you know, photocopied. It's one of a kind. You only have the resources to save one of those things. What do? Do you pick the thing that has the more intrinsic value, but the information it also exists elsewhere? Or do you pick the thing that might be more mundane, but it's one of a kind? I would say the one of a kind thing is more important. It would suck to lose a 1670 will book, but if we've got it on microfilm, the information is still there. The information, at least, is not lost. But that's the kind of decision you're going to have to make. You're going to have to look at things from a priority standpoint. And that's why I want to emphasize again, from working from the center out. You have to identify those things that are critical to your functions and critical to the core functions. First, those receive first priority. Anything that needs to be done to preserve, refresh, replace, restore from backups, anything like that, to those records is priority one. And then it goes outward from there. But even your core function documents may require some really difficult decisions. That's where knowing how your agency works is going to be critical. And for that, you may need to pull in other people around you. You may need to have other people from other areas of your agency say, I know this doesn't seem important to you, but it's critical to what we do, and we can't do our job without this. So you think, okay, well, I wouldn't have considered that critical, but yeah, it's been moved up the list now. It has to be kind of a group effort. You have to have everybody on board, and everybody has to understand that difficult decisions are going to have to be made. And the more critical the disaster, the more difficult those decisions are going to be. One kind of like nebulous question is, how do you know when you're done? How do you know when you've recovered from a disaster? When you've established your core functions again, that's great. That's your primary goal. And then, okay, you're getting your payroll and your accounting done. That's good. How could you tell when things are back to normal? And a big question about that is, do you ever go all the way back to normal, or is there a new normal established? And again, that kind of depends on the scale of the disaster. Using Katrina as an example again, New Orleans is still not like it was before Katrina, but it's to a new normal, right? And they reached that point probably about 2007 sometime, give or take. Earlier in some places than others. I think the population of New Orleans is still like 15 or 20% down from what it was. But there is a new normal. There is a new baseline. And only you can decide when you've done enough and you need to shift out of recovery mode and get back to business as usual mode, even if business as usual looks quite a bit different than it did before. Coming back to some closing thoughts, and this is not going to take too awful much time, but I wanted to leave plenty of time at the end for questions because I know this is kind of a big topic, and we can't get super specific to individual agencies because we're talking to a whole lot of different people. But all of these things I'm trying to say are in theory applicable everywhere. But for the closing thoughts, the most critical points I want to bring up are: an imperfect plan is better than no plan. I don't want anybody to think that because you can't plan a big enough plan for everybody, that you shouldn't take the time to begin. Anything is better than nothing. It's worth the shot. Even if you do it for your individual office, that's better than nothing. Understanding for yourself, if there's a disaster, this is what I need, depending on the circumstances. If it's a fire, I'm not going to grab my laptop and run out of here. If there's a storm, a hurricane coming that's a couple of days away, I might grab my laptop and get out of here. Or I might grab a couple of other files out of my drawers or something to take with me to get my job done for a little while. But don't wait until you can do it perfectly to get started. The more complete it is, obviously, the better. The more you can involve people from all over the agency, that is the ideal scenario. But don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Don't hesitate to start on the smallest level you can and build from there. Okay. And the second one is that if you have a plan that nobody knows about, it's no plan. If nobody else knows about it, then the only person that's helping is you. So if I have the ideal plan for the Library of Virginia, but nobody else outside my office knows about it, and there's a big disaster here, it's going to be limited to what I personally can carry on my back, right? And that's not going to be any kind of way to live. You want to have the plan, develop the plan, but then share it as appropriate. You don't necessarily share your disaster plan to everybody in the world. Nowadays, it's kind of seen as a security risk in some ways. You don't necessarily want somebody to know, that if in case of a bombing at the governor's office, the governor is going to go to this specific spot. You don't necessarily want that to get out. That's security stuff. But the people that need to know should know. The people involved in the governor's protection unit, people involved in life safety and rescue and so forth, they need to know that stuff. That's important. So if you have a plan, make sure it's distributed as appropriate for your agency. That's the second big point I wanted to make. The thing to understand is disasters occur and you can't always prevent them. What do these have in common? Appomattox, Buckingham, Caroline, Charles City, Dinwiddie, Elizabeth City, Fairfax, Gloucester, Hanover, James City, King, Queen, King William, Matthews, Nansman, New Kent, Nottoway, Prince George, Prince William, Richmond County, Stafford, Warwick. All of these counties have suffered what we consider catastrophic records loss at some point in their past. By catastrophic, I mean they've lost some significant portion or near totality of their bound volume records, deeds, wills, court orders, things like that. That's 22 counties. There's another 24 that have suffered what we call considerable records loss, that they've lost a lot of their loose records, maybe a few of their bound volumes and so forth. But taken together, that's about half of the counties in the Commonwealth have suffered some significant, if not catastrophic, records loss at some point in the past. Floods, fires, invading armies was a lot of it. You know, a lot of counties on the eastern part of the state in particular suffered some fires and courthouses and stuff during the Revolution and the War of 1812. A lot of those counties said, well, you know what we're going to do for safekeeping? We're going to send our records this time during the Civil War to Richmond where they'll be safe. Look at that. They were all in these warehouses down by the riverfront where they were burned during the evacuation fire. People were trying to do a good thing to save their records and ended up just putting them in where they turned out to be in harm's way. You can't always predict that kind of thing. But life goes on. This is the legal remedy. This is like part of it. You don't have to worry about it, but you can notice that 41.1-9 in the Virginia Code provides for how you establish ownership of land if the deed book for your county that contains it all is gone, got burned, got taken away by a soldier of an invading army, anything. They establish just a legal procedure for how you deal with that. Because sometimes disasters happen. Sometimes the records are gone and there's nothing you can do. You can't recreate them out of thin air. You have to be able to move forward with what you have. So I want you to understand that disasters happen, but life does go on. I'm sure we all remember 9/11. Those of us that are old enough, and if you're not old enough, you can kiss my rear end. Kidding. But, you know, if you're like me, that was a day that it's kind of like there was America before 9/11 and there's America after 9/11. That's what I was talking about when I talked about a new normal. Okay. The World Trade Center towers were not rebuilt, but they rebuilt on that site, right? They built a new World Trade Center 1. Thousands of people were killed in that. I don't even want to know how many records were in those buildings when they came down, because really in the scope of things, again, the records cost pales in significance to the human cost, to the cost to us as a culture and a society. That things changed so much after that. But a new normal is established and life goes on. If you've ever experienced like a personal loss or grief or something like that, like kind of as a nation we did after 9/11, one of the things that sometimes seems cruel or hard to deal with, you know, if you lost somebody close to you, is that the world does go on. You know, you lose somebody close to you and you're just devastated, and you know, people are just kind of walking around the sidewalk and they don't understand that your life is forever changed. It doesn't seem right. But the truth is that life does go on. And one way or another, we find a way to keep it going on. So while you can't prevent every disaster, and you can't even really reliably plan to ameliorate every disaster, you can plan to the extent of your ability. You know, if a massive tornado was to come through downtown Richmond right now, there's not a whole lot I could do about it. If a F0 tornado came through Richmond, I could kind of plan around that, or an F1 or something like that. A hurricane. We haven't had a serious hurricane strike here in years upon years, but what we have had is like the remnants of hurricanes come through here as tropical storms. You can plan for that. Lots of times things still surprise you. When we had that flash flood in Louisville, the odd thing was not that we got flooding from the ceilings and so forth. The real issue in most of those buildings was because Louisville's water system is kind of antiquated, like Richmond's, uh, their storm water and their sewer water were using the same system essentially. So when the storm water system was overwhelmed, the sewer system was overwhelmed and it backed up into drains in buildings and so forth. So during that massive, massive rainstorm, the flooding didn't come from above, it came from below. I would have never planned for that. I don't necessarily know that anybody else would have either. They're probably smarter people than I am out there, building engineers and architects, something that might have been able to say, oh, by the way, if you ever get 6 inches of rain in an hour, the water system is going to overflow. They may have known that, but I don't think many people in leadership at the time were even thinking about that. So you can't plan for everything, but you can plan for things as best you can. And one way to start is with the Library of Virginia's disaster planning webpage. We've been updating this since December. We think we've got it at a good place where we're happy with it. And it's not a perfect plan that you can take and implement at any agency. It's a place to go to get templates that you can use kind of as a skeleton for your agency and then start hanging meat off of it, right? Put your organs on that skeleton where they need to go and build it the way it needs to be to work for your office. So I'm kind of leaving this slide up here for just a few minutes so people can have a chance, because this is a presentation, I can't just like say, here's a link, you can click it, but it's available on our website. You can click through to it and we would be glad to have you use it. We would be glad to have your feedback from it and see how it works for you, how it doesn't work for you, so we can improve it over time. Because disaster preparedness is part of the Library of Virginia's job. Okay. Oh, thank you, ladies, for putting the link in the chat. So disaster preparedness is part of our job. Consulting on it is part of our job. We will gladly help you on it to the extent that we can. But it really does come back to inside knowledge of how your agency works. And the best people to know about that are the people around you in your agency. So lean on their expertise, work with them on that. And together, hopefully you can prepare as best you're able. And with that, I will conclude the presentation and we will open the floor to questions. Is there an example of a disaster whose severity is mitigated by following a disaster plan? It'd be nice to see a case study. I don't know of one off the top of my head, but I bet you there are some. I bet you there's some in the archival literature, like the American Archivist. I will have to try to look that up and see if I can follow up with the listserv about a disaster recovery case study. That's actually an excellent question. I wish I thought about that while I was coming up with this slideshow. It's really good. I bet you it's out there. I bet you it's out there. No, currently working on your coop. Yes, I understand. And the coop is part of it. The coop, the continuity of operations plan, coop, or continuity of business plan. That's a part of your disaster plan. But it's kind of about establishing operations afterwards. You also want to concentrate on what do you do before the disaster? What do you do during the disaster? How do you deal with your people and stuff? So don't neglect that end of it, but the coop is a big, big part of it. We still have the coop over here. I've got a coop for the Library of Virginia over here on my shelf. Same sort of thing, list of people to contact, vendors and so forth, a list of, this is where the first building records to go check on after we get back in the building, things like that. Any public school employees have a disaster plan in place, please share. By all means, we can share. Suggested storage boxes that would be best for long-term paper records. The vast majority of us just use paper cardboard boxes anyway, because, I could tell you that, the best thing to be doing would be to like get some kind of silicone lined box or something like that would be waterproof or water resistant or something like that. But, in point of fact, the likelihood of any given box of records getting water damaged is pretty slim. So to go to the expense of buying some kind of like water resistant boxes or fire resistant boxes or something for everything doesn't really make a whole lot of financial sense. So the vast majority of stuff we have is just in paper boxes. Don't have any good boxes around to show you, but record center boxes, Hollinger boxes, and so forth. If you have things that are particularly critical, if we have our copy of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, we will have that in a separate storage area, in separate containers, with separate environmental controls. Things that are very important to your mission or what it is you do. There's certainly nothing wrong with creating like fireproof safes or anything like that. But for your everyday records, it's really probably not worth the expense of getting some kind of special storage solution for them. Just regular record center boxes would be fine. I don't know about you guys. I personally have heard about people that have fireproof safes in their house. And when they have a fire in their house and they come pull the fire safe out, the safe is fine. Stuff inside's incinerated. It just got too hot. So not always a perfect solution either. All right, folks, if we don't have any more questions, I am going to stop the recording and we'll end everything. I'm really glad that so many of you were able to join us today. And if not, if you have colleagues that are interested, we will hopefully have the recording out within a couple of days. Thanks a lot, folks.